Chapter 22. Mr. Ralston and I crept through the dark storage chamber above B deck, not daring to speak. Crates and dormant machinery lay on all sides of the vast space, neatly separated, numbered, and stacked. At the far end of the room were the security panels, where a lone technician worked in silence. Not letting our boots make a sound against the hard floor, we slipped closer and closer until we were right behind the crewmen. Then, in a sudden motion, Mr. Ralston reached out and gripped the man around the neck with one arm, using his other hand to cover the unfortunate worker's mouth. With equal speed, I pulled a full hypo from my bag and injected the man with an intravenous sedative. For another moment, Mr. Ralston continued gripping him. Then he went limp, and the data controller laid him carefully down. "Isn't that against the Hippocratic Oath?" he asked, his thin lips giving a slight smile as he turned to the panel. I shrugged as I put the hypo back in the bag. I've never taken it. "How long will he be out?" "Maybe half an hour." "That should be plenty of time." Ralston began scanning through the security subsystems. I watched, even though I was unable to follow what he was doing. He found the cabin security section and murmured, "What's the cabin number?" I blushed as I realized I'd forgotten to find out. I'm not sure. I think it's halfway down the hall on C deck. I think if you're coming from the lounge, it's on your right somewhere." Nodding, he navigated through the system, then stood up straight and spoke quietly. "Got it. To be unlocked only with clearance from the man himself." He turned to look at me, his eyes looking wide in his thin face. "If this doesn't work?" I shrugged, trying to hide my trembling. "We'll get out of here before he realizes what happened. He won't know we were the ones who tried it." I wasn't convincing myself, and I doubted I was convincing him either. I took the last step to the console. Ralston pressed a button, lighting up a small green panel. "Ready for clearance scan," a computerized voice said, making me cringe. I hesitated for a moment, then laid my hand on the illuminated section. I watched as a green bar of light moved over the panel, slowly traveling from my wrist to the tips of my fingers. It gave off just enough heat for me to feel it as it passed, and I forced myself to stop trembling. The light finished scanning and seemed to hesitate. I stiffened. If this didn't work, an alarm would be set off throughout the ship, and despite my assurances to Ralston, I wasn't sure we'd be able to escape detection. Then a clear, ringing beep sounded. "DNA, Howitz, Erasmus, Commander. Security cleared." Then there was a clicking sound and the panel turned off. I pulled my hand away, letting my breath come quickly. Gilders hadn't been positive that it would interpret my DNA as my father's, but it had. Now we could just walk into the room. After moving back a few steps, I turned to face Mr. Ralston. "Tell Gilders it worked." He nodded and started back towards the elevator. I let him use it first as we were going opposite directions. He up to the bridge to tell Gilders and send August to sickbay, I down to sickbay to wait for my brother. My mind turned back to the doctor as I waited for the elevator to come down again. We had just 4 hours to save him. My stomach churned as I waited, and waited. I began picking at a jacket button and scraping my boots along the floor. We had to save him. "What if I have another plan?" a voice whispered. I slammed the door down on the voice, feeling my heart scream. "Don't say that, God. You wouldn't do that. I know you wouldn't." At last, the smooth doors in front of me slid open, and I jumped in. "B deck," I snapped, feeling somehow as though the elevator were to blame for my disturbing thoughts. Who knew how long it would take Gilders to get August down to sickbay? He'd said it could be a while. By that time, the security guard might wake up and warn Commander Howitz. Then the commander would lock everything down again, and we wouldn't have another chance. We should have gotten August down first. I knew why Gilders had decided not to do that. He was worried that if Commander Howitz did realize what we'd done, it would be worse for August if he were found missing from his post. We had to make sure it would work before we involved anyone else. Maybe I could go in and find the machine without August. I didn't know what it looked like, but how hard could it be to find it? It was a machine. Surely I could figure it out. It would probably have some kind of identifying mark on it. No, I shouldn't. Gilders knew we were in a hurry. He'd get August down right away. He'd find some way to do it. I knew he would. I would just have to trust him. The elevator stopped on B deck and the doors opened. I lifted one foot to step out, to walk down the hall to sickbay to wait for August's help. Then I put my foot down again, stood up straight, and said, "C deck." The doors closed again, and I was moved down. I couldn't do it. I had to get down there now and get that machine before it was too late. I wouldn't let the doctor go crazy. Or die. When it stopped, I leapt out into the corridor, afraid that if I hesitated, I'd change my mind. It was easy to find his cabin, and when I had, I stopped in front of it and took a deep breath. Then I jammed my thumb recklessly on the open button to the right of the door. For a crazed half-second, nothing happened. Then the door slid open welcomingly without letting off so much as a squeak. It had worked. Everything would be all right. Jubilant, I slipped into the room and looked around. It was a duplicate of every other officer's cabin except for a row of large, somewhat frightening devices on a metal chest on the far side of the room. I walked towards them, not allowing myself to give in to the urge to tiptoe. I had to figure out which one was the right one and figure it out quickly. There were 5 items on the chest, neatly lined up in a row. All 5 were of different shapes and sizes, though they were all varying shades of gray and black. My heart sank a little when I saw that none of them bore any characters of any kind. Neither letters nor numbers indicated the type of device. Still, I was good with inventions and mechanics. I could figure it out. August had mentioned X-rays, so which one of these could produce X-rays? It would have to be capable of extreme precision to lock onto specific sections of the brain, so I instantly ruled out the simple apparatus on the far left. The controls on the center machine didn't look complex enough either. You do me credit, my dear. My blood froze as my heart stopped beating. The voice was a low, gravelly one that I knew well. I hadn't heard the door open, but the sound of boots stalking towards me was all too clear. I swallowed, feeling somehow that if I just kept still and didn't turn around, I wouldn't have to deal with the situation and everything would be all right. I'd hardly hoped that even with my genes you could have become so inventive, he continued. Unfortunately, you picked the wrong moment to enter. I happened to have this hall's security camera on the screen. Dull pain engulfed my heart. The wrong moment. Yes, it had been the wrong moment. A few minutes later, and we would have succeeded. Andi, you fool. I had hoped that you would trust me, he went on, and his strong hands gripped both my arms in a hold that made me wince. But I'm going to have that medal one way or another. With a forcefulness that didn't match his calm, calculated words, he pulled me back. I grunted and struggled to pull away, knowing all the while that it was useless. My efforts only made him clutch me tighter, and I felt my lower arms begin to tingle with constricted blood flow. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't fight him. Could I reason with him? "Father," I begged, "please. I just wanted the doctor back." Without even acknowledging that I'd spoken, he turned and began pushing me towards a metal closet on the other side of the room. Taking one hand off me, he pushed a button to open the door. I took the opportunity to pull against him and try to wrench his hold off with my free hand, but once again it did no good. I twisted around and tried blindly to kick him in the shin, but he gripped my other arm again and held me at arm's length facing him. I stopped struggling and stared into his eyes, which were a warring combination of hatred, hunger, despair, and triumph. The triumph I understood, but the rest left me confused. After 10 seconds of silence, he spoke. "Genevieve Lavinia Sanderson. You were named after her. Her. You bear her name, her face, her determined—" He choked, and the other emotions were swallowed up by loathing. Understanding flashed upon me. He'd told me that Langham's disease could only be contracted by babies and by pregnant women. He heaved me into the closet, and my head hit the hard metal back. I was dazed, but before he closed the door, I addressed him once again. "She had the disease, didn't she?" He stopped his hand midway to the button and stared at me, his small pupils constricting more than ever. I sat up straight and looked him straight in the eyes. "My mother," I went on. "She had Lingham's disease, didn't she?" The hate stared out of his eyes, but I was unabashed. "You didn't get enough of the cure before the mine was destroyed," I said slowly, figuring out as I went along. "You only got enough for me." "We didn't know," he yelled, clapping his palms on both sides of the door and leaning inward. I didn't shrink back. "So you wanted to take my Radialloy and give it to her. You wanted to sacrifice my life for hers." "I loved her. You can't even begin to understand how much I loved her. I wanted to save her." "By killing me?" I cried. "It wasn't killing you. You would have died in the first place if it weren't for me. You killed her." My eyes tingled with unshed tears, but I kept on, my voice beginning to waver. "Did you tell her your plan, or did she find it out?" "Do you really think I would have told her?" "So she took me away. She took me where I would be safe." Fierce pain grabbed my heart as I thought of the doctor. "If it weren't for you, if it weren't for him, she would still be alive." A paroxysm of fury contorted his face, and the last vestige of pretense fell away. "You deserve to die." He pounded his fist on the button, and the metallic door slammed shut, leaving me locked in darkness. I didn't hear his footsteps as he left the room, but I felt no doubt that he had. My bravado drained out of me, and I sank to the floor, resting my back against the cold metal wall of the closet. Even if August and Gilders realized what I had done, my father would have locked the door, and he'd be watching the systems now. The trick wouldn't work twice, and there were just over 3 hours left to save the doctor. Why didn't I just stick with the plan? Oh, why couldn't I have just done what Gilders and my conscience said to do? The same reason I hadn't listened when the doctor told me not to listen to Erasmus. I trusted myself before all others. I was so desperate to keep things the way I wanted them that I couldn't let the future rest in anyone's hands but my own. As it had turned out, my hands were anything but competent. My wristcom let off a tiny, faint square of green light, and I could read the black numbers flicking from digit to digit on it as the seconds went by. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. 30. I heard nothing, felt nothing but the cold metal through my jacket and the coarse fibers of the commander's uniform against my cheek. 50 minutes. There were only 2.5 hours left until 12. Something snapped inside me, and I dropped my head to my knees, hugging them to my chest. I sobbed, releasing pent-up tears that did nothing to relieve the horrible, consuming ache in my heart. After endless long minutes of sobbing and numbing, I felt myself drifting, moving away from reality. I wasn't worried about suffocation in the closet, for a thin crack under the door provided air. So I let myself drift. There was nothing I could do. Nothing. I couldn't even try any longer. All I could do was to sit and condemn myself. One moment I was slipping out of consciousness. The next I was jolted awake by a sudden feeling that I was falling. Momentarily disoriented, I reached up to brush something from my cheek and felt a uniform pant leg. Then my head cleared and I sat up straight. A beep startled me, causing me to hit my head on the back of the closet. Then the door slid open and I blinked, dazed in the sudden light. 2 men stood there, but at first I could only make out blurry forms. I saw that one was short and one was tall and bulky, which led me to guess that it was Pete and Sigmet. When my vision sharpened, my guess was confirmed. "Hurry," said Sigmet, beckoning with one rounded hand. Pete held a small electronic device pointing at the closet lock. He lowered it as I stood up. "We have to get out before he finds us." I didn't see how I could be any worse off with them than with him, so I stepped out of the closet. A thought made my stomach tie itself in knots. "Did they save the doctor?" I asked. Pete slipped the device in his pocket and gripped my arm in one continuous motion, then began pulling me along. My heart hurting until I couldn't bear it, I managed to look at my wristcom as he dragged me out. It was 3 minutes past 12. "Answer my question or I'll scream," I cried as we rushed out into the bright white corridor. "Don't be a fool," Pete insisted. But Sigmet said, "No, he's still in captivity." My world ended. It was too late.